published this last fall by Verso Books, and it's called Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict. And it's not what he's covering in the lecture tonight, but it certainly is the long background to the position that he's taking. In fact, Norman, if this book had been available last September, it's the text I've been looking for a long time on dealing with the history of the conflict. And I can say that in a way just by reading briefly to you from another major one of the new historians on the history of the conflict, Avishtaim of St. Anthony's College in Oxford, writes on this book that Norman Finkelstein is one of the most radical and hard-hitting critics of the official Zionist version of the Arab-Israeli conflict and of the historians who support this version. In this book, he launches a frontal attack not just on Zionist thinking, but on Israel's policy toward the Arabs since 1948. His work is scholarly, incisive, and highly original, but the quality that makes it stand out is its intellectual integrity. The book makes a major contribution to the study of the Arab-Israeli conflict and deserves to be widely read, especially in the United States. And I could add to Avishtaim and in Canada, because one is dealing with a very similar environment on the understanding of this conflict. He deals very effectively in this book, and I push it a bit more. You can see we have some signing ceremonies. The book is nicely for sale in the Carleton University bookstore, and it's also at Prospero and Octopus, where he's signing tomorrow at 12 at Prospero and at 3 o'clock at Octopus on Bank Street. What Chapter 1 does is make available something that hasn't been well known outside of the doctoral dissertation at Princeton, which he wrote on Zionist ideology, where all of the trouble that he got into began on dealing with something that he came at rather tangentially from someone who is really a political philosopher, and was dealing with deep questions of philosophy and ideology associated with 19th century thinking and how it was translated into the events that we're all so much more familiar with the latter part of the 20th century. The second chapter repeats something that also is not widely known, although parts previously published, and that is the extraordinary expose which he wrote on a book which sold millions of copies in 1984 about the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict, arguing, this is Joan Peters' book from time immemorial, that argued that Arabs didn't live there but only moved in response to the growing success of Jewish colonists. Now, this book had 1,800 footnotes and supposedly represented an enormous piece of scholarship. And where many of us who spent longer in the trenches than Norman has on this should have recognized from the beginning the enormous expose that was needed to show the fraudulent nature of this book at a time it was being highly touted by some of the leading scholars in the United States. To this day, I can sit here with the Ottawa Citizen and the Toronto Globe and Mail wrote rave reviews of a book which, thanks to Norman, was first exposed as a complete fraud, undoubtedly, in my own view, written in Israel. Victor Ostrovsky, whom some of you also know of local Ottawa fame, in fact told Norman later that he participated in the Mossad project in which this book was written to overcome negative publicity in the United States about Israel's invasion of Lebanon. And that's really what lay behind it. Now, mind you, someone who sets up himself as an expose of this kind of massive fraud is going to get in trouble, which has been much of the story of all of us who've slipped in sideways to this conflict over the years. The chapters 3 and 4 deal with the very important group of new Israeli historians who have now had access, first of all, to the Israeli Defense Force records, and not dealt with so much in this book, but we have at least one who didn't intend to be a new historian, but has ended up being one, Itamar Rabinovich, who used to be a professor at the Norman Patterson School at Carleton University, has had access for the first time to the Israeli Foreign Office records, where he showed that every single Arab government held secret negotiations with Israel from 1948 to 1952. All were willing to recognize the state of Israel if something were done about the Palestinian refugees. And so the whole kind of myths on the beginning are now becoming much clearer. Things that were always argued on the Arab side, but without that full documentation, that is now coming from the scholarly community. He picks up very much, of course, after that whole debate on 1948 in this book, with a really hard-hitting chapter on the origins and consequences of the 1967 war, which is another one of these great mythical ones that you'll see references to all the time. I just had to write to one of the online encyclopedias, which talked in their newest version that you can now get on cyberspace of when the Arabs invaded Israel in 1967. These kinds of things very much get repeated over and over again unless challenged. And then there is a chapter as well in 1973, and this book closes with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Tonight, he's dealing with an assessment of the Oslo Accords. We're in a deep period of only the deepest concern right now. All of you are following the events more closely even than I on cyberspace about the depth of the suffering which is now taking place as a result of the closure, which is likely to continue right to the end of the Israeli election. So he comes to us with a fresh insights on, I think, one of the most difficult times we've gone through in a long period. And so I'm particularly pleased to have a chance to welcome someone whom I so greatly admire as Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's always a pleasure to come to Canada and to this university. I very much doubt in the U.S. you would get an audience of this size any longer to discuss the events in Israel-Palestine, mostly because the assumption is, and there's certainly grounds for the assumption, that Israel has effectively won, and there's a kind of quiet jubilation, and therefore the forces of, so to speak, evil don't feel obliged any longer to turn out for events. They're just quietly rubbing their hands in glee. What I wanted to discuss this evening is the present status of the conflict, in particular the Oslo Accords, more especially the Oslo II Accord, the one that was signed September 28, 1995. I guess I should begin by putting in some sort of context relevant to the most recent turn of events, and I refer here not to the closure, though I'll come back to that towards the end, but rather with the suicide bombings. Nobody, I think, would want to search for any extenuation of the suicide bombings which targeted, obviously and without, as I say, any mitigating circumstances, targeted civilians, and is totally deplorable. On the other hand, it seems to me the way the media is portraying the event is fundamentally false in at least one crucial respect, and that is the media is claiming, and scholarship as well is claiming, that these suicide bombers had sabotaged or were attempting to sabotage a peace process. Now that, it seems to me, is flat out false. There isn't a scratch of evidence to prove, no documentary evidence certainly, to prove that what's unfolding now in Israel-Palestine is a peace process. What's effectively unfolding is a defeat process. Israel is now in the process of completing its conquest of mandatory Palestine, and as its juggernaut proceeds across the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians, many gripped by despair and despondency, are engaging in actions which, however deplorable, it seems to me, are at least to some extent predictable and inevitable. As Professor Said writes in his most recent book, Peace and Its Discontents, probably the most remarkable fact about the reaction of Palestinians to their systematic humiliation, degradation, and dispossession, probably the most remarkable fact is how little violence and, in effect, terrorism it's evoked and elicited. Now, as we're entering the terminal phase of Israel's conquest, it's obviously eliciting and evoking more violence, deplorable, but as I said, it seems to me at any rate, pretty much predictable. It's people refusing to go to their graves alone. Obviously, it's wrong to want to take others with you. On the other hand, it seems to me reasonably understandable that some do not wish to go to their graves peacefully. Well, having said that, I think my next task is obviously to try to prove that claim, that there isn't a peace process unfolding, but factually there is a defeat process on the Palestinian side and a victory process on the Israeli side. There have thus far been published 3, in my opinion, useful and insightful critiques of the Oslo, I won't use the terms peace process because I find it so offensive, even in quotes, so let's just call it the Oslo process. There have been 3 useful critiques published, in my opinion. One by the Israeli former vice mayor of Jerusalem, Meron Ben-Venisti, his remarkably candid, in my view, accurate book, Intimate Enemies. 2, Professor Chomsky's contributions, most substantively the last chapter of his book, World Orders Old and New. He's written other articles since, but the basic framework is laid out in the 3rd chapter of that book. And 3, most recently, this one written not by an Israeli and not by an American, but by a Palestinian. It's Edward Said's Honorable Dissent, Peace and Its Discontents. None of the 3 books, however, were published, were able to take into account the Oslo II Accord. They all basically refer to Oslo I, the September 1993 Accord. I will try to focus in these remarks on Oslo II, because the fact of the matter is, from here on in, that's what we'll be dealing with. Oslo II is the practical implementation of Oslo I. Oslo I was the global framework, the principles as they were called. Oslo II is the blueprint. And it's a hefty document. It runs to over 300 folio-sized pages. It's remarkably detailed in some respects and remarkably vague in other respects, a topic I'll also return to. The reigning wisdom on Oslo II, I'll just quote to you from the most recent issue of the New York Review of Books. Amos Oz, the dovish Israeli writer, condemning the Hamas suicide bombings, he stated as follows: "There are hundreds of clauses and subclauses to the Oslo Accords, but the essence is clear and simple. We stop ruling over you and suppressing you, and you recognize Israel and stop killing us. But up until now, we have delivered and you haven't." So that's pretty much the reigning wisdom. You'll find no challenges in the full spectrum of opinion, either in the United States or I suspect Canada as well. now that there are Palestinians who can lend their credentials to filling out the spectrum and saying the right things, speaking the party line, they no longer have any use for dissenting voices. They can always call up the local PLO to supply some hack to say the right things and get his check at the end of the week. So the point of view that will be presented here is not, I think, available anywhere in the mainstream media. I'll use as my guide Professor Said's book, but I'll develop it, as I say, because Professor Said's book was not able to take into account the specific clauses of Oslo II. The essence of the September 1993 Oslo Agreement, we'll call it Oslo I, according to Said, was that it gave Palestinians consent to continued occupation. Indeed, the PLO agreed to serve, in Professor Said's words, as Israel's enforcer. A close reading of the September 1995 Oslo II agreement only reinforces Said's case. Up until the Oslo Accords, an international consensus basically existed on how to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. Essentially, it said that Israel was, under international law, compelled to withdraw from all of the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinians would be able to exercise their rights of self-determination within the area that Israel evacuated. The PLO accepted those terms. Israel and the United States did not. Turning to Oslo II, it reads, "Neither party shall be deemed, by virtue of having entered into this agreement, to have renounced or waived any of its existing rights, claims, or positions." On the surface, that seems like a perfectly balanced article in Oslo II. Neither party has to give up its rights, its claims, or positions. The problem is, up until Oslo I, the universal consensus was that Israel had no rights in the West Bank and Gaza. The Oslo Accord now grants a legitimacy to their claim that they have rights. Similarly, up until Oslo I, the universal consensus was that Israel had to renounce its claims and its positions on the West Bank and Gaza. After Oslo I and II, Israel's claims and positions are now granted a legitimacy. The West Bank and Gaza, Said writes, have now become, once they were occupied territories, now they have become disputed territories. Thus, with Palestinian assistance, Israel has been awarded at least an equal claim to them. In other words, once beyond dispute, Israel's withdrawal will now be subject to the give and take of what are called permanent status negotiations. With Palestinians on the one side and Israel and the United States on the other, not too much imagination is needed to predict who will give and who will take. On all crucial issues, Jerusalem, water, reparations, sovereignty, security, land, Palestinians, according to Said, have in effect gained nothing. Indeed, looking closely at Oslo II, one discovers that the picture is rather bleaker than Said suggests. I want to go over carefully those issues because they're the heart of the Accord and really the heart of the conflict. Let's start with Jerusalem. Amid an analysis of Jerusalem as the nexus or the core of Israel's conquest strategy, Said observes that in the history of colonial invasion, maps are instruments of conquest. Now, will you be able to hear me in the back if I refer to the map? Can you hear me? Good. I want to refer to the map of Oslo II. If you look at the text of Oslo II, it states that Jerusalem will be left for final or permanent status negotiations. Turning to the official map of Oslo II, the one to which the PLO lent its signature, we discover the following. This area here, in a kind of pale brown interspersed with a white, this is Israel on the map. If you look at Jerusalem, this is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now part of Israel. I'll return later to what's called areas A, B, and C. Areas A, B, and C are the areas in which the West Bank was divided according to the Oslo Accord. The notable fact for our purposes is Jerusalem is not in Area A, it's not in Area B, and it's not in Area C. Jerusalem is part of Israel. Looking at the map, Jerusalem is a closed issue. It's no longer part of the permanent status negotiations. To judge by the map, Israel has already annexed Jerusalem. Another aspect of the map. This is Israel. This is the West Bank. How do you know where Israel ends and where the West Bank begins? I sat poring over the map for several days trying to figure that out until it dawned on me that's the whole point. Israel has erased the line separating Israel proper, or pre-67 Israel, from the West Bank. The West Bank has already been annexed. There is no longer what's called in the literature the Green Line. The Green Line is where hostilities suspended at the end of the June 1967 war. The Green Line, the dividing line, the border between the West Bank and Israel, has been effaced on the official map. Israel, if you look at the official map, is no longer an occupying power. The area from the Mediterranean to the Jordan is now a unitary entity. Number 3, if you look at the text of the agreement, it says that the territorial integrity of the West Bank as a single entity has been maintained. The territorial integrity of the West Bank as a single entity has been maintained. Now look at the map. This represents one kind of control, the areas in yellow. The areas in brown represent a second kind of control. The areas in white represent a third kind of control. In other words, the yellow and brown blotches awash in a sea of white. The Sea of White, incidentally, is the area of Israeli sovereignty, according to Oslo II. The yellow and brown blotches awash in a sea of white. They just almost mockingly belie the textual claim that the West Bank is still a single entity. Its integrity has been maintained. Looking at the map, all told, what do you get? What you get is what Israel has always wanted. The claim is that Mr. Rabin and the Labor Party generally overnight became peaceniks. Well, what does the map show you? The map shows you that since the late 1960s, the Labor Party has been trying to implement what it calls the Alone Plan. The Alone Plan called for incorporating about half of the West Bank into Israel, consigning the areas of what are called dense Arab settlement to some kind of Palestinian self-rule, taking Jerusalem, well, you can continue, but the point is quite obvious. Looking at the map, what you get is an extreme version of the Allon plan. The Allon plan called for incorporating approximately 50% of the West Bank. Looking at the map, they're taking about 70%. Otherwise, this is what Israel has always wanted. There has not been any concession by Israel. What there has been is effectively an Israeli triumph, a victory. The ones who concede, it seems fairly obvious, are the Palestinians. Turning now to the issue of water. What does the agreement say? Oslo II says, we'll give Palestinians a little extra water during the so-called interim period. The interim period is a 5-year period beginning from May 1994. It's a 5-year period. We'll give Palestinians a little extra water. However, it says that we have to maintain the same distribution of water between Israelis and Palestinians that existed up until the Oslo Accord. What is that distribution? Well, surprisingly, the Israelis supply let me just recall, it's not an appendix, it's called let's see. It has a schedule, Schedule 8. Turning to Schedule 8, the Israelis admit, what is the distribution? Israel gets 80% of West Bank water. Palestinians get 20% of West Bank water. Well, fair is fair. That means an Israeli consumes typically 4 times as much water as a Palestinian. You know, Israelis are fond of saying that Arabs are dirty. Well, were that the case, they would have an explanation. If Israel would stop stealing their water, maybe they could take a bath. But that's actually not the worst of it. Then we come to what the status of water will be in the final status negotiations. Israel, in all its generosity, states that we do recognize Palestinian water rights in the West Bank. Well, that's an awesome concession. Israel recognizes that Palestinians have rights to their own water. But, it says, listen closely, the ownership of water will be decided in the permanent status negotiations. So whatever rights Palestinians may have to the West Bank water, they do not include ownership, which presumably means that they will have the right to purchase it from Israel. That is, Israel now claims officially that it has the right to Palestinian water on the basis of what it calls historic usage. What is historic usage? It's a nice euphemism. What it means is, having stolen Palestinian water for nearly 3 decades, Israelis now proclaim it's theirs. Proudhon would not have been surprised. As you know, he coined that famous expression, property is theft. Let's now turn to a third crucial issue, reparations. Professor Said makes what seems to me a perfectly rational point, where one operating in a rational universe, that inasmuch as Germany had to pay reparations to Jews, and Iraq, by virtue of UN resolutions, is duty-bound to pay reparations to Kuwait for what was, after all, just a several-month occupation, he asks, why aren't Israelis duty-bound to pay to pay Palestinians reparations for a 3-decade-long occupation? It's incidentally, if I just may make a digression, a brief one, it's a remarkable fact which has gone completely unmentioned in discussion that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza now exceeds in length the British mandate over Palestine. It's a period of now quite, by historic standards, a substantial chunk of time has elapsed in the course of this occupation. In any case, what does Oslo II have to say about reparations? It's really well worth reading. It gives you deep insight into the generosity of heart of Israelis. First of all, of course, we're not giving Palestinians any reparations. But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it reads as follows. The newly elected Palestinian Council must accept all liabilities and obligations arising with regard to acts or omissions which occurred in the course of Israel's rule. So whatever ravages Israel committed in the course of the occupation, the Palestinian Council must now accept all liabilities and obligations. In what I call the special chutzpah clause of Oslo II, chutzpah, as some of you may know, is a Yiddish term for audacity or nerve or brass. It says as follows. Say a Palestinian takes Israel to court on the grounds that their home was broken, their home was blown up, their land was stolen, they were cheated out of their social insurance benefits when they worked in Israel. Say one of them goes to any court, a Palestinian court, an Israeli court, or even a world forum, suing for damages. Oslo II says, the Palestinian administration, quote, must immediately reimburse Israel the full amount of any award that is made against Israel by any court or tribunal for its past crimes. So if any court finds Israel guilty and Israel must pay up, the Palestinian Council must immediately reimburse Israel the full account. Now I suspect in the whole history of peace agreements and non-peace agreements, that must be truly a first. Now there's an interesting comparison here which I'll return to. There's an interesting comparison here which I'll return to at the end of the discussion. Namely, compare the behavior of the racist, cold-hearted South African government. When South Africa withdrew from parts of the territory it conquered and created these areas of self-rule, eventually called Bantustans. In other words, when it pretty much did exactly what Israel is presently doing, South Africa, however cold-hearted, however racist, and nobody would deny either, continued to foot the bill for all Bantustan budgets to the tune of between 60 and 80%. The Transkei budget, 60 to 80% was paid for by South Africa. The Venda budget, the Bophuthatswana budget, the KwaZulu budget. They were all completely subsidized by South Africa. And compare their behavior with Israel's. Not only does Israel refuse to give a cent to make Gaza, which it destroyed, systematically destroyed over 30 years, not only does it refuse to give them a cent to make Gaza functional, but it demands an immediate reimbursement if anyone should find them guilty of any crime in the course of their occupation. Let's now turn to the issue of sovereignty. Nowhere in Oslo II will you find the word withdrawal. There is no withdrawal from the West Bank because, as you see from the map, you can't withdraw from what's already part of you. The map, there's only a unitary entity. What Oslo II refers to exclusively is redeployment. They have redeployed their troops. The Palestinian Council's purview excludes, according to Oslo II, Jerusalem, settlements, military locations, refugees, borders, foreign relations, and Israelis. That's all outside the sovereignty of the Palestinians as well. Furthermore, Israel retains, listen closely, and you'll get a clear sense of what Palestinian sovereignty consists of. Israel retains full criminal jurisdiction over offenses committed anywhere in the West Bank by Israelis or against Israel or an Israeli. All of that is outside the purview of Palestinians. Regarding internal Palestinian affairs, a council cannot amend or abrogate any existing laws or military orders without Israel's acquiescence. So much has Israel proscribed Palestinian quote-unquote sovereignty, because it's quite obvious it consists of exactly nothing. So much has Israel prescribed Palestinian sovereignty that there's even a clause in Oslo II, which again, I dare say, is probably unprecedented in the history of peace and even war-making. There's a clause which states that postage stamps, Palestinian postage stamps, quote, shall include only the terms the Palestinian Council or the Palestinian Authority. They do not even have any rights over the wording of their postage stamps. Let's turn now to the question of security. What rights do Palestinians have there? They have no right over external security. That's all Israel's. They have no right over security of Israelis. That also is Israel's responsibility. Thus, in the name of security, Israel is free to pursue any Palestinian anywhere in the West Bank. Let's look at the other side. Israel has control over external security. It has control over all internal security relating to Palestinians. What rights do Palestinians have in the West Bank? Well, first of all, Oslo II is very explicit. They are duty bound, according to Oslo II, to protect Israeli settlers and Israeli settlements. However, the Palestinian police, let me quote, shall under no circumstances apprehend or place in custody or prison any Israeli. They have to defend and protect the settlers. They have to defend and protect the settlements. The settlers and settlements which up until Oslo I were illegal under international law. but they can't so much as lay a finger on any settler who assaults, murders, or maims them. Furthermore, Israel has total control over the closing and opening of crossing points to the West Bank and Gaza. I would want to add, or I should point out, that all of Mr. Arafat's protestations that Israel is violating the accords when it enters Palestinian areas, as it did with Yahya Ayash, when it closes checkpoints, all of his protestations are flat out false. In that respect, Israel is on very solid legal ground. The agreement that the PLO signed gave over all of those rights to Israel. Israel retains responsibility for security at the border crossings to the West Bank and Gaza. Accordingly, it has the right, explicitly in Oslo II, to detain or deny passage to any person entering through the Palestinian wing, and enjoys exclusive responsibility for all persons entering through the Israeli wing. In other words, it has total control and rights over who enters and who leaves the West Bank and Gaza. Said contemptuously dismisses these arrangements as a one-sided farce. That's not exactly true, though. According to Oslo II, Palestinians get to hoist their flag at the Palestinian entrance. And there are 3 pages, I kid you not, pages 92 through 6, but it's 3 full pages, of the Oslo II Accord delineating 3 different statuses of PLO VIPs who will have special treatment at the border crossings. You have a good sense of where Mr. Arafat and his cronies invested their efforts and where they didn't. 3 pages on VIPs, and I kid you not, I think I actually have the accord. It's so shameful, you want to cry. Your heart sinks when you look at it. The very last page of the accord, page 314, has a few lines about Palestinian prisoners. 3 pages about VIP status, and the last page is on the Palestinian prisoners. Lastly, the question of land. The accord calls for Israeli redeployment from 30% of the West Bank, the areas which are represented in yellow and brown here. The accord says that in the future there will be further redeployments, but it doesn't specify how much or where. Even more interesting than that, however, is in the 30% that Israel redeployed from, the accord explicitly states that Israel still has legal rights to the 30%, which means on the issue of land, they have absolutely conceded zero. Professor Chomsky makes the point in one of his articles that Israel only conceded 1 to 3%, namely the areas called Area A. Those are the areas in brown, the major cities. In fact, we both discovered subsequently they didn't even concede 1 to 3%, because the accord says in its multiple appendices and annexes, if you search through them, that Israel even claims legal rights to the lousy 1 to 3% that they conceded. And what does the map look like all told? It's quite remarkable. Some of you, is there anyone here from South Africa? Just out of curiosity? No? Because this is exactly what the South African map looked like. The Bantustans, each of them, Transkei, Venda, Bophuthatswana, and so forth, each of them consisted of major and minor fragments surrounded by white settlements. The Bantustans were not contiguous areas. And this is what Israel created, almost a caricature of the South African Bantustans. There are about, I tried to count them, it's impossible. I mean, it's possible, but it was too time-consuming. All of these little things here, these little blotches, it's sort of like the West Bank broke out in a rash. These are the areas of more or less Palestinian control. And there are about 150 of them. I gave up counting after around 110 because it seemed like a pointless exercise. KwaZulu consisted, that was the one that was led by Chief Buthelezi. It consisted of about 40 fragments. So it's more or less in line with the South African precedent, to which I'll return presently. Before I do so, however, an obvious question arises. Namely, why did Palestinians get such a pitiful deal at Oslo, whereas on the Egyptian front there was a full withdrawal in the Camp David Accord? And it really is a question worth pondering. If you look at the Camp David Accord, or let's just backtrack a little, beginning in 1971, Sadat, the president of Egypt, offered Israel a full peace in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. Similarly, the Palestinians, since the mid-1970s, have been offering Israel a full peace in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. And then the obvious question arises. Why did Egypt get the full withdrawal and the Palestinians got a full zero? Some people would want to claim security, that there are basic security issues on the West Bank which didn't arise in the case of Egypt and the Sinai. That, alas, the historical record shows, is flat out false. Because you must remember that the war in 1967 did not break out on the Palestinian-Jordanian front. It broke out on the Egyptian front, in the Sinai. And Israel maintained from 1967 to 1973 that it has fundamental strategic interests in the Sinai, in particular the area called Sharm el-Sheikh, which it can never, under any circumstances, even a full treaty, abandon. As the famous remark of Moshe Dayan put it, we prefer Sharm el-Sheikh without peace to peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. So Israel was claiming on the Egyptian front also basic security interests. It's not as if security issues arise in the West Bank that didn't arise on the Sinai front. They did. One need only go back and look at the record. I don't want to plug my book. Professor Sigler did a good job of that. But I quote at length, I mean to the point where people found it, my friends, my editors, found it tedious, because it was literally every other month. Israel kept insisting, we have fundamental security interests we must keep a third of the Sinai and Sharm el-Sheikh. So the answer can't be security. As we all know, Ben Jonson once wrote that patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels, and security, as we all know, is the last refuge of scoundrel states. It can't be security. Well, what then accounts for Israel's full withdrawal from the Sinai, but not from the West Bank? And the answer, unfortunately, it's unfortunate, but it's obvious, that Egypt went to war in October 1973, and it proved itself to be a military power that had to be reckoned with. Up until 1973, Israelis suffered from this kind of purblind triumphalism. The claim was made routinely in Israeli literature that the Arabs, or to quote Ezer Weizmann, war is not an Arab game. Arabs don't know how to fight. That was the inference from the June 67 war. And Israel assumed it can have its way everywhere where it had conquered territory because the Arabs are militarily inept. Well, the October 73 war proved otherwise on the Egyptian front. The Egyptian performance was, by military standards, not ones I care to even quote, but they were remarkably impressive. Everybody acknowledged that. And Israel realized it had to sign a treaty with Egypt because Egypt was a formidable power. And it was quite obvious what the terms would have to be. They would have to be a full Israeli withdrawal. The point being that in 1993 at Oslo, the Palestinians were in obviously a pitiful situation for a whole number of reasons that all of you are familiar with, I suspect, ranging from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the petering out of the Intifada to the disaster, the Gulf catastrophe, and so forth. The Palestinians had no cards to play, and Israel did what every conquering power does. Namely, Israel, like every conquering power, only understands the language of force. And in 1973, the language of force compelled it to make a full withdrawal. In September 1993, all the force was on their side, and they did what any conquering power would do. They imposed a settlement that gave them everything. There's also one other useful comparison between the Egyptian Accord, the Camp David Accord, and the Palestinian one. The Egyptian Accord, the Camp David Accord of 1977, runs to about 7 book-sized pages. The Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty of 1979 runs to approximately 10 pages. In very simple, lapidary words, it says, Israel will execute a full withdrawal, Egypt will sign a peace treaty. Very simple, very clear. Compare the 7 pages of Camp David or the 10 pages of the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty with Oslo II. Oslo II is 300 plus folio-sized pages filled with multiple annexes, appendices, clauses, subclauses. This is not a document or a blueprint for the emancipation of the Palestinians. It's a blueprint for their emasculation. And it's very obvious just by the sheer scope of this accord, and I might add, by its sheer absurdity. Imagine a peace treaty which proscribes the wording on postage stamps. Could you imagine, for example, Nelson Mandela signing a treaty like that? Its absurdity is almost mind-boggling. Well, that exhausts, at least to the extent that time allows, that exhausts the letter of the Oslo Accord. Nonetheless, it doesn't exhaust the topic of whether or not Palestinians will get something out of Oslo. Because you may wish to make the argument that although the letter of Oslo gives Palestinians nothing, and frankly there isn't a single Palestinian I know that disputes that claim, you may wish to argue that even though the letter of the accord gives Palestinians nothing, nonetheless, through the accord's provisions for a Palestinian council, a Palestinian police force, and so forth, maybe Palestinians will, in practice, be put in a better position to achieve true self-determination. The tacit assumption, the Pollyanna-ish assumption, is that any new reality must improve on the present state of affairs. Yet, the new reality will more than likely allow for the tightening of Israel's grip on the Palestinians. This is the Bantustanization scenario projected not only by Said, but even Israeli analysis like Meron Ben-Venisti. Ben-Venisti in his book calls Palestinian self-rule, and now I quote him, a euphemism for Bantustanization, and he calls the Oslo I Accord, and I call him again, a prolongation of the occupation by remote control. The remote control, of course, being the new Palestinian Authority. Well, how do you prove or how do you demonstrate that Oslo II in practice will lead to nothing? You obviously can't prove it. The most you can do is argue by analogy or look at historical precedents. And the most useful historical precedent is the one that I've already suggested, and the one that's suggested by the very terminology that Meron Ben-Venisti uses, Bantustanization. Namely, let's look at the South African precedent and see how usefully it illuminates where events in the West Bank and Gaza are going. After World War II, South Africa faced basically the same dilemma as Israel, an ethnically exclusivist state which has an ethnically heterogeneous population. Like Israel, South Africa came after World War II under severe international condemnation for trying to maintain the rule of an ethnic state in an ethnically heterogeneous among an ethnically heterogeneous population. So the South African government, after World War II, under the leadership of Verwoerd, instituted a policy of separate development or apartheid. Verwoerd, the South Africans, they used the language of decolonization. They said the areas which they were withdrawing from, what eventually became the Bantustans, that these were colonies. We are withdrawing from them. We are giving the colonies independence. Originally, incidentally, they did not say independence. They said self-rule. They used the Israeli term, what subsequently became the Israeli terminology. Now, as some of you no doubt know, this is a very deceptive kind of decolonization, because South Africa kept for itself the lion's share of resources and left the South African blacks in a state of complete thraldom to the South African government. On the other hand, even though this is obviously an agreement which the South Africans would benefit by, or would seem to benefit by, many South Africans opposed the withdrawal and the creation of the areas of self-rule because in their view, not unlike the case in Israel, the areas of self-rule may become too politically powerful, they may become bases of what South Africans called Mau Mau terrorism, and so forth. On the other hand, many sincere foes of apartheid, at the beginning, just like in the Israel-Palestine case, supported the Bantustan project. They thought, to use Arafat's language, it would be a first step toward justice. So, in both cases, it's pretty much the same general framework. But the framework, it's not just a case of the general framework, it's also an exact comparison when it comes to details. I don't have time to go into all of them. I just want to highlight a few to show you what becomes very clear when you read the Oslo Accords, that either by intuition or by calculation, they are almost, in fact they are, a carbon copy of the accords that created the Bantustans in South Africa. That sounds like a tall claim. Let me just give you some examples. The Bantustans, as in this case, comprised multiple fragments of barren land. The South African government forcibly removed from the designated homelands white settlers who angrily charged that they had been sold down the river. The first homeland granted self-rule was Transkei. What was it given? I'll just quote to you, and you'll recall what I said about Oslo. Transkei was given a flag and a national anthem, like the Palestinians. However, it only had control over taxation, education, public works, agriculture, the courts, and welfare. South Africa reserved for itself jurisdiction, listen closely, over external and internal security, foreign affairs, communication, transportation, population movement. It retained a veto on all Transkei legislation, and it retained jurisdiction over whites within Transkei's borders. That is the Oslo Accord, in a nutshell. There's one crucial difference, though, one which I won't have time to develop now, namely that in the South African case, everyone, and I mean even the apologists of apartheid, acknowledged that the Constitution South Africa wrote for Transkei left them powerless. That is, they got nothing. Everyone acknowledged that. And the unfortunate turn of events in Israel-Palestine, how does the discourse read? Not only is there not an acknowledgement that Palestinians got nothing, but rather the contrary. A dove writes, Mr. Amos Oz, he writes, "We stop ruling you and suppressing you, and you recognize Israel and stop killing us. But until now, we have delivered and you haven't." In the Oslo case, the whole burden of responsibility has shifted to the Palestinians. Furthermore, exactly as in the Transkei case, or the Bantustan case generally, they created what were called growth points. That is, they tried to attract foreign investment with the incentive of cheap labor and tax concessions. Exactly what is now going on in the West Bank. They call them now industrial parks. And exactly in the case of the West Bank, only a handful of people actually benefited from these agreements. Now, there's one other crucial point which I want to emphasize, and that is South Africa did grant all the Bantustans full independence in 1976 in the case of Transkei and the others later. And that's a very important point. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the Bantustans. They were legally fully independent. Nonetheless, the whole international community, literally, there was a UN vote on it, condemned the Bantustans as a sham. The point being that, in my view at least, the likelihood is that Israel will eventually grant those pitiful areas from which it redeployed, they will grant them independence. The unfortunate thing is, in the Palestinian case, that's probably going to be viewed as a compromise and reasonable settlement. Whereas in the South African case, everyone understood it was a farce. Why was it a farce? For basically two reasons, and that's where I'm going to leave off because I don't have a time for a dialogue with the audience. Even the conservative critics of apartheid, namely those who were generally sympathetic to apartheid, they recognized that even if the Bantustans were granted independence, it was grossly unfair because South Africa took everything and left to the indigenous African population what was worthless. Everyone understood the transparent unfairness of that compromise, even though the Bantustans were fully independent. Again, the remarkable fact is Israel's seizure of everything worth taking from the West Bank and Gaza. The only thing they left was the people, because they don't want them. They want the land, they want the water, they want everything useful, but they don't want the people because they don't fit into a Jewish state. In the case of Israel, Palestine, that's considered or viewed as a fair deal, a compromise. Whereas in the South African case, it was transparently seen as fakery, a sham, and a disgrace. Let me just quote to you, I want to just quote, this is not just my opinion, let me quote to you again Meren Benveniste. Referring to Oslo, he states as follows, referring to the terms of the accord. While Israel is free to act independently in its own sovereign area, it insists on coordinating the usage of natural resources by the Palestinians so that Israeli interests will not be harmed. This asymmetry perpetuates the existing inequality in the distribution of common natural resources and re-emphasizes the impression of a victor's peace. Listen to his last words. For the Israelis, it is peace without pain or sacrifice, a bargain proposition. They gave up nothing, they took everything. In the South African context, that was readily understood to be unfair. But Palestinians who now, and it's shameful but it's true, who now rank in humanity's great chain of being, they rank below South African blacks. The fact that they're conceded nothing, absolute zero, nothing, that constitutes, in the discourse of Israel and Palestine, a fair compromise. Well, as I said a moment ago, that was the conservative critique of apartheid. But there was also a radical critique of apartheid, the one which eventually proved to be more prescient. That critique was that apartheid simply could not work. The reason being that the areas set aside for the indigenous African population and the areas set aside for the white population were so closely connected in every meaningful sense, historically, economically, socially, demographically, that you can never, in any meaningful sense, separate out the reality of the Bantustans from South Africa. Simply put, as some of you no doubt know, South Africa was totally dependent on Bantustan labor, and the Bantustans were totally dependent on work in South Africa, and, as I mentioned earlier, the financial grants of the South African government. Simply put, that means that the Bantustan arrangement, or apartheid generally, was a fiction. You could never, in reality, unscramble the whites and the blacks in South Africa. And the fact of the matter is, in my view, the same basic reality obtains in Israel-Palestine. So to quote Ben-Veniste again, I'm quoting him because he is the former vice mayor of Jerusalem and the recognized authority on the West Bank and Gaza, and also remarkably honest in certain respects. He writes, referring to the Oslo Accord, he says, "The Accord provided for the establishment of a permanent committee to supervise cooperation in a long list of areas, such as water, electricity and energy, finance and international investment, banking, the port of Gaza, communication, transport, labor relations, and so on. The long list of areas in which cooperation and coordination is essential points to one basic fact that the advocates of separation have yet to grasp. The country, from the Jordan to the sea, can perhaps be divided politically, but not physically." And I think that's accurate. There is no longer, if there was ever a possibility for a two-state settlement, it no longer exists. The area from the Mediterranean to the Jordan is now a single integral entity. There is no way to unscramble Israel from Palestine. There are possibilities. You can exterminate the Palestinian population. I think that's a doubtful prospect. You can expel the Palestinians. It's a possible but an unlikely prospect, because Palestinians compose roughly half the population between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. It's about 3 million, 4 million now, if you include the Israeli-Palestinian population, which I do. And the third possibility is such a massive Jewish immigration that it renders the Palestinian population trivial by comparison. That's what the American solution to the indigenous problem consisted of. I don't think that's a possibility either. Barring extermination, expulsion, and massive Jewish immigration, what you have left is an integral entity between the West Bank, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. It's a pipe dream to imagine that you can unscramble them. It's a fiction. And here I want to just conclude with Edward Said's words in his last chapter. Throughout the book, Professor Said clings, his book being Peace and its Discontents, he clings to the idea of a two-state settlement. But you can see that reality has sunk in for him as well, as it will for anybody who's journeyed there. I was there most recently during the Palestinian so-called elections, And the settlements they're no longer settlements. We have to be honest about that. They are full and integral communities in the West Bank. Said, as I said, in his last chapter, he writes, Palestine, Israel, is a place where two peoples, whether they like it or not, live inextricably linked lives, tied together by history, war, daily contact, and suffering. To speak in grandiose geopolitical terms, or to speak mindlessly about separating them, is nothing less than to provide prescriptions for more violence and degradation. There is simply no substitute for seeing these two communities as equal to each other in rights and expectations, and then proceeding from there to do justice to their living actualities. As Said's parting words suggest, the inevitable, if very, very distant future, is one in which Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, enjoying reciprocal, communal, and individual rights, coexist within a unitary entity. Consigned to a footnote, Oslo will no doubt be dismissed one day as a sordid detour, a really shameful detour on the path to that just and lasting peace. Thank you.
Before I open the floor to questions and answers, the acoustics in this room are very poor. So I'm going to ask anyone who has a question to please rise from their seat and speak as loudly and as clearly as possible. I'll allow approximately 2 minutes per question and a supplemental, and then I'll have to move on. So that's the basic format. The floor is officially open, and I'll try and recognize the hands as I see them. First question.
My question is, you mainly discuss the unfairness and excessiveness of the Israeli state. Would you mind shedding some light on the role of another frontline player who plays as a jury, judge, advocate, and judge at the same time, in the United States? What it gets from where its interest lies, what it gets from the destruction of Palestine?
The question basically, I think to put it simply, is what accounts for the United States' inflexible support for Israeli actions in the Middle East? How do you account for it? That's obviously a very complicated question for which there are no obvious or simple answers. Arguments generally range between two camps: those who argue that it's the decisive influence of the Jewish community in the United States that compels the U.S. government to act in ways which is contrary to its interest. That's one view. And a second view has it that Israel serves useful policing functions in the Middle East for the United States, and in exchange for the useful policing functions that Israel serves, there's a kind of quid pro quo. That is, Israel will do the U.S.'s bidding, but Israel asks something in return, and the return it asks for is a free hand in the conquest of Palestine. My own predisposition is to support the second view, but I don't think it's a case that can be easily proved. I think there are arguments on both sides, but there's no question in my mind, at least, that Israel performs an important policing function, and that probably in the future, contrary to all of the claims, its status as a local police force will be enhanced there. Israel does for the United States what the PLO is now doing for Israel.
Yeah, go ahead. Can you stand up and speak loud?
I have a comment, actually. It's not a question. I read this article saying that Israel couldn't catch this fast and smart boy, which is Hamas, and so they got this little dog, which is PLO and Arafat, for free to do it for them. And the other point which I want to make is that you said all Palestinians, they consider this as compromise. Actually, those who are, they know themselves by Palestinians, they consider it as compromise. But Muslims, they don't consider it as compromise because you can see that it's a steal. It's not a compromise.
Well, actually, I don't believe that any Palestinians regard it as a compromise. I said the unfortunate thing is the way the international community is reacting to all that's unfolding, and unfortunately, the PLO's acceptance of the Oslo Accords played a crucial role in legitimizing the international community's abandonment of what had been a quite substantial commitment over some 25 years to a reasonable and just resolution of the conflict. Had the PLO not given its stamp of approval, I think it's unlikely that the international community could have so completely abandoned the position that it held for some 25 years.
Okay, go ahead, and then Dan. Yeah, go ahead.
This time, the Oslo Accords are made between Israel and the PLO, presumably. My question is, should the PLO disappear or becomes declared insolvent or bankrupt? Do those accords carry any weight onto somebody else, onto the Palestinian people in general? Are there any provisions within the accords that say, should, for example, the PLO becomes redundant, then somebody else is going to be liable for those obligations that you so well described for us tonight?
Well, I'm not perfectly clear on the legal question, but the fact of the matter is legalities have precious little to do with it. The United States and Israel are creating, as they go along, the legalities. The PLO is already bankrupt and without resources. It's simply being kept alive through funds channeled by the international community through the United States and Israel. It already is an entity whose lifeline comes from the outside, and historical experience is quite compelling. That you can always find a stooge to do the dirty work and just call it the PLO. I mean, there's not much difficulty. I'm sure there are 1,000 Palestinians waiting online, some even in the United States, who would like to fill that position, fill their pockets with some gold, and enjoy the good life. So I don't think that poses any kind of serious barrier to the plans that are now unfolding.
Dan, go ahead.
Thanks, Norman, for your insightful presentation, and welcome back to Ottawa.
Thank you.
Good to see you again. I'd like to ask you about the parallels you've drawn with South Africa and bring them a little further, in particular in relation to the ANC and its long historical, for many, historical weakness in its development from the early part of the century on through all the periods that you outlined. And I'm wondering if you could see some parallels or make some parallels with the PLO and questions of tactics, and how did the ANC overcome its weaknesses to actually become current government of a unified state, while the Palestinians and the PLO are struggling with a Bantustan situation?
Well, there are different ways of trying to divide up responsibility. Professor Said puts, I think, the onus on the PLO, claiming that they bungled many opportunities. I happen not to agree with that. The fact of the matter is the Palestinians were in a almost impossible situation because they were waging a struggle against the most powerful country in the history of humanity and its local surrogate. And the likelihood of them having prevailed was in any circumstances very modest. So even if they had done everything right, I don't think the prospects were bright. The fact of the matter is, history, is replete with examples, the fundamental lesson of which is force works. And Israel and the United States are able to apply enough force that eventually, I guess what was almost inevitable, the Palestinians would succumb. The one crucial difference between the Palestinian case and every other one is simply that in the case of Vietnam, the Palestinian, South Africa, and elsewhere, the leadership never gave up on its ultimate goal. Whatever detours it may have made along the way, the ultimate goal remained absolutely fixed, and it wouldn't accept any agreement short of that ultimate goal. So Nelson Mandela, for example, refused to renounce the right of armed struggle until the South African government had agreed to one person, one vote, and democratic elections. And what happened in the case of the Palestinians is that their leadership renounced everything but got absolutely no commitments in return. Quite the contrary, as I said at the very beginning, the Accord explicitly states that Israel does not have to waive any of its claims or positions, and furthermore, that it can still claim its rights. Now, obviously, in the comparable case of South Africa, you couldn't imagine Mr. Mandela negotiating an agreement where South Africa insisted on its claim and right and position to apartheid. But that is the analogy. The Palestinians conceded. I want to emphasize, I am not personally putting the blame on the Palestinians. I think, in my opinion, the bulk of the responsibility is the United States and Israel, the exertion of brute force, which ultimately caused the Palestinians to succumb. As to the errors the Palestinians made, I think that's their problem. They have to clean up their house. It's not my problem.
Professor Gohary?
Norman, thank you. 3 fast questions. Answer any or not. But
Any, none, yen.
But in your analysis of the question that cries out for some further elaboration is why the PLO caved in. Now, you quickly said collapse of the Soviet Union and the petering out of the Intifada and the debacle of the Gulf War. But what else do you add? Is it just the corruption and venality of Arafat and the PLO? Is that all that has to be said?
Well, yeah.
Can I rush?
Yeah.
Does the name David Brooks mean anything to you? Wrote a book on water. Wasn't it, John, was it IDRC or CETA? IDRC. And I've not read the book, but he gave, personally, what I thought was a rather sanguine interpretation of the fairness of the water distribution. Are you familiar with David Brooks?
I'm not familiar with him. I mean, it's almost laughable.
Well, since it involves Canada and Canadian funding, it's of some pertinence. We have a national magazine here called Maclean's. Question number 3. Barbara Beale wrote a piece in which she was excoriating Arafat for having secretly said in Stockholm, was it, or in Oslo, that this was, to the Arab ambassadors, that this was just a preliminary tactical move, and the ultimate aims have not changed one bit. Now, do you know anything about that? The Guardian then did an analysis and said that story was probably an Israeli plant. But I wonder if you have any information about
Okay, I want to connect the first and the third questions. You asked, how do you account for what Professor Said, I'm going to use his language because I just don't feel it's proper for me to be passing these kinds of judgments. So I'll just use his language. How do you account for the PLO's capitulation at Oslo, capitulation being Professor Said's word? Well, there are 2 basic points. One is there's an old adage, if you can't beat them, join them. And I actually think that's basically what the PLO did, and frankly that's what most of the Palestinian intellectuals in the United States and presumably Canada as well did as well. They realized it was a sinking ship, the Palestinian cause. They wanted their hour of glory, their hour of power and privilege, fame and fortune and so forth. So they just switched sides like typical venial academics and joined, well, it's true, and joined the bandwagon. And of course there was a little niche for them, because Professor Said, they wanted him off the spectrum because he was saying the wrong things, and so he wasn't reciting the party lines, so he had to be off the spectrum. And then you have to fill it out with a Palestinian or Arab face, because that's called balance. And so they got all these Palestinians eagerly waiting to fill Professor Said's shoes, and they got their fame, their fortune. They get to go to all these conferences, go to Jerusalem and to discuss the future of Jerusalem. You know, if the ground is being taken from under them, they're sitting there talking, yakking, free trips, good time, good food, and all the rest, and you know all the rest. So, of course, and as I'm telling you, there are always 1,000 stooges who are ready to play that game. And I think for Mr. Arafat and his cronies, if you can't beat them, join them. There's also a second fact, which is exactly as in the case of the South African Bantustans, there will be an elite who will benefit from it. There's no question about that. Every arrangement, however absurd, needs some sort of social basis in order to sustain it. And there will be a handful of, Nabil Shafs who are going to rake in the cash and have the good life at the expense of the Palestinians. And the third fact is, as we all know, the human capacity for self-deception is bottomless. It's probably the most salient characteristic of the human consciousness. You can convince yourself of anything. And if you go back and look at the Bantustans, you'll read that, I'll just quote, give me 1/2 second. I'll just quote to you Mr. Boudelezi. At the time the Bantustans were created, he said as follows. He says, "The reason I'm doing this is not because I believe in apartheid, but because I have no choice." Exactly like Arafat says, there's no choice. He says, "But my real purpose is," and this goes back to what Mr. Arafat, you say, allegedly claimed in Stockholm, "my real purpose is I want to create a liberated area from which I can engage in the liberation struggle on South African soil." Elsewhere he said, "Why am I doing this? We have created a springboard from which we can go forth to conquer in ever-widening circles. We have created for our black South Africa a liberated zone," exactly what Mr. Arafat is claiming, "from whence we can mount our strategies and attacks on apartheid, which are vital to the country as a whole." And again he says, referring to his acceptance of self-rule, "It may be a contribution to the unraveling of the problem, insofar as, if we attain full independence, our hand will be strengthened." Well, what ought to be obvious is, these are exactly the rationalizations that the Palestinian Authority and its various apologists are making. For all I know, they sincerely believe it. I'm not disputing their sincerity. As I said a moment ago, people can believe quite strange things. The point is not whether these claims or protestations are sincere. The question is, what does the historical record reveal about what came of these Bantustan's homelands? The fact of the matter is quite clear. The record is clear. The Bantustans did not serve as a transit point to true emancipation. What they became was a major obstacle to it, because ultimately the Bantustan administrations linked their fates to the South African government, and when the mass movement arose in South Africa, they were on the wrong side of the barrier, assuming that we have the same barrier, the same side in mind. They were on the wrong side of the barrier. And so my suggestion is, whatever the Palestinian Authority is claiming, and as I say, for all I know, these protestations are honest and sincere, they are pretty much beside the point. You can see with pretty much clarity where things are headed. They will not abet the cause. They will be an obstacle to it.
I have two questions. The first one is, why do you, as a Jewish person, who might be considered an adversary, do what you're doing right now? And the second question is, it's one thing to critique, but it's another to try and offer solutions. I'm wondering, what do you envision to be a solution to the Palestine-Israel conflict?
Well, the first question I kind of like to avoid, because I think it's sort of like there's a kind of self-aggrandizement, an element